Robert Monroe documented his out-of-body experiences with the methodical detachment of a field researcher. But as his work progressed, he found himself burdened by a repetitive task. Each time he separated from his physical form, he was hit by a barrage of localized signals, distress calls from the edge of death that demanded his intervention. He traced these anomalies to a specific, chaotic zone bordering the physical world, a region he classified in his data as the interstate. The entities transmitting these signals shared a single roadblock. They were newly deceased, yet paralyzed by the sudden lack of a physical body, unable to comprehend their current state. Monroe approached the phenomenon as an investigator confronting a systemic flaw. He set out to map the hidden architecture of human death, documenting the barriers that kept consciousness from moving forward. In Case File 01, Monroe encountered a deceased man in a city apartment, arguing furiously with himself. The man was fixated on a woman in the room, refusing to accept that his situation had changed. The subject was entirely oblivious to his own death. He remained unaware that he could no longer manipulate the physical objects or interact with the people in the room around him. Monroe informed the man plainly that he was dead. The subject responded with hostile rejection, growing furious before wrenching himself free and diving into a chaotic mass of other trapped humans below the interstate. Chaotic denial acts as an anchor. It traps consciousness at the immediate border of death, creating a vacuum in the research where a successful transition should be. Case File 02 presented a different blockage. Monroe encountered an elderly woman in a hospital bed, curled in a fetal position and moaning in acute pain. He applied a new methodology here, explaining to the subject that her biological pain was a residual memory. Since her physical body had already expired, the sensation no longer had a source. As the woman looked around and accepted her non-physical state, her posture relaxed. She called out the name Ernie, took Monroe's hand, and began a gentle ascent away from the hospital room. Breaking the barrier of phantom physicality appeared to be a requirement for progress. Once the memory of the body was shed, the consciousness could finally move beyond the initial borderland. Case File 03 involved a teenage boy hiding in a small-town alleyway following a shooting. The boy insisted he was fine, claiming he had simply run from the scene. Monroe directed the boy's attention to the sidewalk, where a crowd had gathered around the boy's own body. Confronted with the visual evidence, the boy's defensive posture collapsed. Monroe leveraged a specific name to secure the boy's trust: Uncle Ben. Though the boy was skeptical, as his uncle had died years prior, the certainty of the claim eventually reached him. This chart tracks the boy's upward guidance through the structural layers Monroe called the belief system territories. During this ascent, the boy vanished entirely. He left behind zero trace radiation, disappearing from Monroe's perception in an instant. This vanishing suggested a specific structural transition. When a subject dropped off the local tracking radar, they were moving toward a destination that Monroe's current instruments could not yet map. Case File 04 took place at a rocky cliff above a prehistoric jungle. Monroe found a group of heavy-featured, humanoid figures gathered at the edge. The tribe's belief system required them to leap from the cliff to reach a deity named Megus. However, one woman noticed a flaw in the system. When she jumped, she no longer fell. She simply hovered in the air. Monroe intervened to correct her understanding of the environment, demonstrating that floating was the new baseline reality once the physical world was left behind. As the woman adapted and rose toward the interstate, she too dissolved into nothingness, repeating the pattern seen in previous cases. Dismantling these localized, earthly belief systems systematically cleared the borderland. Each successful intervention ended in the same migration to an unseen destination. After weeks of these interventions, Monroe noticed his own sleep becoming calmer. The density of distress calls began to thin, with fewer signals reaching him during his out-of-body movements. This quiet was eventually replaced by a single, massive macro signal. It pulled Monroe into a solid, grounded state where he was met by a radiant figure who led him toward a distant light. He had moved past the transitional waiting rooms and into an environment that stretched as far as he could perceive, far beyond the boundaries of the interstate. Monroe stood before a boundless space, filled with hundreds of upturned faces. A harmonious hum of voices filled the air, all radiating a sense of overwhelming warmth. He concluded that this was the I there, a state where the vanished subjects from his case files converged into a shared consciousness, freed from the constraints of Earth. Monroe realized that the love shared by this collective was the greatest empirical known in existence. As this understanding settled, he began to rise above the sea of faces. In mid-air, rising slowly above the vast and shimmering collective, a single hand reached up from the crowd and firmly grasped his. A man rose to join him, grinning with a look of recognition. Monroe's research had led him to a vast collective, leaving behind the question of who specifically waits at the end of the journey.